Welcome back to Understanding Exceptional. Today I'm going to talk about the distinction between an IEP and a 504 accommodation plan. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and I get a lot of questions about what is the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan. Here's some of the misinformation. There is thinking out there that a 504 accommodation plan means the individual does not have a disability because it's not technically special education. But a 504 accommodation plan is guided by Section 504 of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So by the very title that guides the programming, you have to have a disability to qualify for a 504 plan. And what I've seen at times is schools say, well, a 504 plan is not special education, so we're not saying there's a disability, so let's go that direction, because if you don't want your child to have a disability, then a 504 keeps them out. The reality is it does not. It requires a disability, and so that would be misleading at best. So the 504 requires a disability or a suspected disability. Here's a huge caveat that often is not understood by people out there. You don't actually have to go in with a medical doctor's note. Let's say your child's been diagnosed with ADHD or diabetes or whatever it may be, a medical condition that impacts their ability to access instruction on some level. Therefore, we're going to create accommodations through that plan. You don't have to have a medical diagnosis. You simply have to suspect a disability. That is the only criteria to qualify for a 504 accommodation plan. So in other words, a parent could go in and say, I believe my child likely has ADHD, and I'd like to look at developing a 504 plan. In most districts and in most settings, that triggers eligibility. That allows you to now develop a 504 accommodation plan. So just keep that in mind, that in many cases, it's a suspected disability, not one that's been confirmed. That is part of the language in the law, suspected disability. So moving forward, 504, let's stay over here in this column. 504 allows for accommodations around instruction. So what's an accommodation? If you watch some of the prior videos, talked a little bit about this, but an accommodation is altering in some way the ways in which an individual receives instruction or demonstrates their knowledge. And it can't change the curriculum. So an example of an accommodation, you're provided with extra time on tests. If reading's a little bit hard for you or you're distracted, you can have extra time on the test. Same test, using the same curriculum, same questions, but you can have extra time if you need it. You can sit towards the front of the classroom if you're easily distracted. You can take tests in less distracting environments if you are easily distracted. Same test, just smaller environment. You can have notes provided prior to lectures. You can go down to the nurse's office if you need insulin or you need a break from class. But at the end of the day, these instructional or accommodations in the educational setting do not provide any opportunities to change any methods around instruction. So they are simply accommodations to accommodate accessing the curriculum and all the requirements as they are already written. So you're not allowed to change any aspect of the curriculum itself, only accommodate accessing it. That's a 504 plan. Now let's open up the IEP, which includes anything in a 504 plan. An IEP allows for any instructional accommodation necessary, any and all. So everything in the 504 area here can and will, when necessary, be included in an IEP. So a 504 is accommodations. An IEP allows for modifications. You can change the curriculum. If your child is struggling in mathematics and there's a curriculum that's much more tangible, hands-on, and is shown scientifically to be effective in working with brains that learn math differently, you can now implement that curriculum, and the district must implement that curriculum. They must have curriculums available to you that allow your child opportunities to learn using different methods. So a different curriculum means a different set of tools to interact with the brain that we have in front of us to achieve success. So in other words, when these individuals put forth the effort that's required, we're using the right tools so that their efforts equate to their personal success. Such an important factor As we talk about constantly here, this equation, the motivation equation, involves effort and desire, and the equal sign is success. And if we put a lot of effort into something and we desire to do well, but our success is significantly lower, we start to lose motivation or we start to get very frustrated. It's a natural human response for all of us. When we put a lot of effort in and don't get much out, it's frustrating. So adjusting the curriculum, modifying the curriculum is not lowering the bar. It's simply using different tools that ideally engage that particular brain in a more meaningful way to allow them to achieve success. So we can modify the curriculum in an IEP. We cannot do that in a 504. The second part is we create quantifiable goals in the IEP. So the IEP is going to have specific goals, reading, writing, math goals. We're starting here in terms of our levels. We're going to implement this curriculum, and we'd like to see progress to this point, which we will measure along the way in this period of time. So the IEP is good for 1 year, as is the 504, but throughout the year with an IEP, unlike a 504, you're going to monitor progress because you've created quantifiable goals. Again, goals related to learning. Learning can be reading, writing, and math. It could be socialization, could be emotional regulation, it could be executive functioning. But you're going to create quantifiable goals that use a specified curriculum to achieve specified outcomes, desired outcomes. So curriculum modifications and goals are in an IEP. They are excluded from a 504 plan. And the final part is now we can bring in all of those 504 instructional accommodations into an IEP. So whatever may be needed, extra time on tests, test taking in less distracting environments, notes provided prior to tests, whatever accommodation would and could be available to somebody on a 504 plan is absolutely available to anyone on an IEP. So the 504 plan generally is a much, much lighter version of an IEP because it only allows for instructional accommodations. And don't be fooled that the 504 plan is not related to a disability. This is Section 504 of the Americans with Disabilities Act, where an IEP is guided by the Individuals with Disability Education Act. This is special education technically, whereas a 504 is not, an IEP is. But at the end of the day, both require acknowledgement or identification of a disability. So it's not necessarily beneficial to say, let's just do a 504 because that means we're not recognizing a disability. You, in fact, are. So a couple final important distinctions. Lots of times schools will say, hey, let's just try a 504 plan. Why might they do that? Not assuming anything negative necessarily, but a 504 plan, there's no goals. There's no quantifying progress towards specific learning goals. There's no curriculum adjustments. So these are just, let's just do a couple different things and see if we can't get this individual where they need to be. Just a few simple accommodations. This holds very little teeth. It holds very little weight, and it's much easier for schools to administer and to supervise throughout the year because nothing's really required. We're just going to present this to all the teachers, and they need to do what's on this document. They need to provide extra time on tests or let a child leave the classroom if they're feeling overwhelmed. That's it. In my experience, I've found these 504 plans are pretty flimsy. When I was a school psychologist, I would hold 504 meetings before the start of the year because every teacher needs to know what's in a 504. Every teacher, PE teacher, music teacher, language arts, doesn't matter. They all need to know. And I would sit down and take 5 minutes and say, this is this remarkable human being. They are a rock star. Met them last year. You're going to love them. But these are some things that you must do in these areas based on the 504 accommodation plan. And it was shocking because more times than I care to admit, teachers would say, they have a 504 plan. I had them all year last year. I had no idea. These documents tend to get stuffed away in the cumulative folder and kind of forgotten. That isn't to say that's the standard. That isn't to say your school doesn't do an amazing job with their 504s. But the reality is they hold a lot less teeth, so there's a lot less monitoring that has to take place. Whereas that IEP really holds schools to account. It requires that they look at the instructional methods themselves, that they develop quantifiable goals, and that they make adjustments accordingly. And so this is why I've seen many instances where schools are trying to subtly or not so subtly encourage, well, let's just do a 504 plan. And the reason why that is because this is so much more involved over here on the IEP. It is a more involved process to get there, but it's worth it if your child needs it. So to just default to a 504 because, I don't want to make issues with the school, don't want to create waves there, and probably it will work. If your child truly needs adjustments to the ways they're being taught, curriculum adjustments, not lowering, oftentimes raising, but modifications to the curriculum, in addition to those instructional accommodations. And if you want to develop specific goals related to their progress, which at the end of the day, if we can quantify learning, we're so much further ahead. Why not do that? Let's figure out where we're at and where we need to get to and how we're going to get there, and let's track our progress. So the IEP in that regard is much, much stronger. And I often encourage families, if they're on the fence, do we go 504? Do we go more IEP? I recommend the IEP can be there for protection if needed. You can write those goals. The goals can be pretty basic, related to milestones of progress, and we can keep track of that. And we can always make adjustments if we're over here in the IEP. If we're just in a 504, that kind of those services are oftentimes, or those accommodations oftentimes are forgotten, and they simply don't have the same level of power, the same bite as they might, as an IEP does in the educational setting. So the distinction is this is a much lighter document overall, and this is a much more meaningful document if a child actually needs it, if they require changes to the curriculum. You want to go towards the IEP, which will engage the special education process. Again, the special education eligibility, these words, these diagnoses, these labels are nothing more than opportunities for new tools. The system has set it up where they say, if you don't do it like most of us, or like they did it 100 years ago, well, you must be doing it wrong. There must be a word. And that's part of the diagnostic catastrophe we've created, is we suggest that anyone that doesn't do it like we used to do it, or like the vast majority of people, including those that are exceptionally bright, most individuals that qualify for an IEP are extraordinarily bright. They simply learn differently. They learn differently because their brains operate differently in a wonderful way in many, many cases. But they therefore need different tools to allow them to learn in the ways that align with how they learn. And so these words, these disability terms, these disorders, think of them as nothing more than opportunities to put new tools into the toolbox to allow instruction to match your child's ways of thinking, ways of processing information. So hopefully that was helpful regarding the distinctions between a 504 and an IEP. Actually, Janine, drop this in there real quick, one more area. One final important note regarding 504s and IEPs. An IEP is a modified curriculum, and you can only modify a curriculum through high school. So IEPs end when a child graduates from high school, when a student graduates. I suppose they're not a child at that point. So when an individual graduates from high school, when they receive their diploma or GED, the IEP stops. That's what the law says. The IEP stops. Now, anyone that's had an IEP could and really should be eligible for continuation of instructional accommodations through a 504 plan. You can take a 504 plan to college. You can take it to many jobs. Any institution that receives federal or state funds must provide accommodations to those with disabilities. And so when your child transitions from high school into the college setting, I would ask that the educational team hold a meeting, a transitional meeting from the IEP to a 504, so that when you enroll them in college, you have a 504 that was created by an educational team that you can hand to that university. Things like extra time on tests, notes provided prior to lectures, preferential seating if needed, test taking in less distracting environments. Those are all things that can be carried forward into the collegiate setting. Any university that receives public funds must have a department that provides these services and recognizes and or develops a 504 accommodation plan. So the 504 continues on through adulthood. The IEP ends when high school ends through a diploma or a GED. So again, hoping that some of this information was meaningful, informative, and as always, join the Understanding Exceptional community at understandingexceptional.com. Like, comment, ask questions, get involved, subscribe, do all of those things. The more involved you are, the more progress we make. Looking forward to seeing you on future videos.